Okay, so sorry about making this into another video. So the first video talked a lot about intersectionality, and I needed to add a slide, so therefore the break. So now we can get into intersectional approach. An intersectional approach recognizes that these multiple intersections exist in endless combinations and that they can sometimes lead to privilege and potentially discrimination. So some examples or an example from National Collaborating Center for Healthy Public Policy. I thought it was a very good example that captured intersectional approach. So the essence of an intersectional approach can be seen at its most basic level in the phrase black woman. That is, being a black woman is not the same thing as being black plus being a woman. The social, political, and economic forces that create the social position of being black and those that contribute to that of being woman cannot simply be added to one another. They intersect to become something new, and they do so with various other social locations to create specific and conjunctural locations of disadvantage. So it is important to note that the same processes that create disadvantage also produce locations of privilege. Being white, male, wealthy, and educated is also more than the addition of its parts. We can only understand how these positions often equate to advantage where they intersect. So some applications of Canadian approaches. So there's main applications of intersectionality inspired approaches currently in use and being developed in the Canadian context. They use intersectionality as a promising approach to reducing inequality at the level of policy, state, and institutional, and all are specifically connected to increasing health equity. So, two uh, examples or approaches are one with the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, and the second is the Institute for Intersectionality Research and Policy. The Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women adopted an intersectional feminist framework in their work in the early 2000s after a lengthy internal examination of their practices. They realized gender based analysis was ill equipped to deal with intersectional realities faced by women or men in these groups. So, in November of 2003, a strategic planning working group composed of CRIAW staff and board met to develop a strategic plan framework. The framework includes a revision of CRIAW's mission and the development of CRIAW's external strategic priorities, such as encouraging research and policymakers to use an integrated feminist analysis. CRIAW's constitutions, after changes were made, instead of having representatives from each province and territory, directors are now selected with particular attention to balancing the following criteria: regional representation, equity groups, language, and skills. Another example is the Institute for Intersectionality Research and Policy at Simon Fraser University, which has become the hub around which intersectionality studies in Canada, particularly those related to health and social policies, have gravitated in recent years. The Institute has produced a number of analyses and publications of varied scope and has developed a framework, Intersectionality Based Policy Analysis Framework, IBPA. So, this IBPA framework revolves around a set of guiding principles intersecting categories, multi-level analysis, power, reflexivity, time and space, diverse knowledges, social justice, and equity. And is composed of 12 questions. So the first part, I hope this is uh, viewable or at least big enough to see, and if not, it's decent size at least for the PowerPoint. So when I share this, you'll be able to see it. So the first part is more of the descriptive. Number one, what knowledge, values, and experiences do you bring to this area of policy analysis? Number two, what is the policy problem under consideration? How have representations of the problem come about? how are groups differentially affected by this representation of the problem, and what are the current policy responses to the problem. And the next seven are of the transformative type of questions. What inequities actually exist in relation to the problem? Where and how can interventions be made to improve the problem? What are feasible short, medium, and long term solutions? How will proposed policy responses reduce inequities? How will implementation and uptake be assured? How will you know if inequities have been reduced? How is the process of engaging in an intersectionality based policy analysis transformed your thinking about relations and structures of power and inequity, the ways in which you and others engage in the work of policy development, implementation, and evaluation, broader conceptualizations, relations, and effects of power asymmetry in the everyday world? So, I thought we could bring up some. Now we have some time to go over some case study, um, and hopefully this might lead to some more conversation in the room, at least after this presentation is done, and kind of just to illustrate intersectional approaches, and in the current context or even in past contexts. So. Um, I thought this was a very good example of Hurricane Katrina. So it included the intersections of race, poverty, and climate change. And during Hurricane Katrina, 80% of people who lived in the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans, the area most impacted, were permanently displaced, the majority of whom were black. Black homeowners also received, on average, $8,000 less in government aid for recovery than their white homeowner counterparts. So this kind of shows you that the intersectional approach of, like I've mentioned, race, poverty, climate change, and a real life example or real world example where there's institutional structural forces and some discrimination at forces that are working here that had compounded this problem. So racial and income challenged communities bearing the brunt of the crisis and facing even more discrimination in disaster recovery due to worsening climate impacts repeats itself in continuous patterns worldwide. So you can see in other examples, the earthquake in Haiti, or the tsunami in Southeast Asia about 10-15 years back. You can see there the intersections of numerous identities at play, and there's lots of structural and institutional and kind of those forces that are at play. So another case study that I got from Sen and Iyer was more of a quantitative example, and they examined the magnitude of inequalities in immunization in India. And their analysis showed that urban, male, and non-scheduled caste and scheduled tribe children were better off. However, with an intersectional analysis, they showed that there were immunization coverage gaps between rural, female, and the scheduled tribe children and urban male. Other caste children were even wider, confirming that social hierarchies consolidate disadvantage at the extremes. In this example, when adjusting for wealth and mother's education, rural males had the highest chance of immunization in contrast to urban, female, and subcaste children. So policy and program implications include the need to focus on female and the subcaste children and inequalities in urban contexts rather than focus on class alone. So another example. So there's qualitative and quantitative examples that are widely available. But these are just two cases I thought were showing different aspects, um, and I hope this presentation, um, or at least these cases, kind of solidified what intersectional approaches are in your mind, and hopefully this encourages discussion among the group and on online. And when I was making this presentation, I used the hurricane example. Um, so now you can compare and contrast with like how Hurricane Dorian is now, and like for example in out east in eastern Canada and Nova Scotia area, and comparing and contrast that with Hurricane Juan, which has happened in the same area in 2001 2002, and at that time um, it, they were not prepared, and there was widespread disruption in services, power, etc. A lot of people were affected, and compare and contrast that to now, where this time, Eastern Canada, they were ready for their hurricane, and it doesn't appear that many people. I mean, there were no fatalities or any of that sort of thing, or um, and it appears that only like some areas were out of power, sure, but it seems like everything is on the road to recovery pretty fast there. So um, a little bit of a different context, but and you can apply this really to forest fire evacuations or earthquakes or any other example. So this comes to the end of my presentation, and um, thanks for bearing with me um, for this webinar. It's the first time I'm ever doing this type of thing. Um, so there won't be any time for questions, but I hope there's some good discussion in the room. And if there are some questions next week, then we can go over them during our check-in. So with that, I will hope that these videos load properly, and I will be sharing the slides with Stanley to distribute. And I hope you all have a great rest of your academic half day. Thank you.